Greetings, good day, good night, wherever you are in the world. You are now tuned into the vault. You are listening to Trust Christian, Own Nothing, Control Everything. Just wanted to do a podcast, a recording today to go over something that is known by all wealthy individuals. And it's just not something that's known by most individuals that are not. So today's episode is going to be why don't rich people pay more in taxes? And I'm going to go over that. As you all know, Trust Christian, I have a private education from private mentors, many of them, not just one. Come from a private system of education, and just really want to share with you all the benefits of investing in your private education as opposed to your public education. So, why is it that rich people don't pay more in taxes? The reason why uh, you pay less in taxes as a rich person is because you are privy to certain financial information when you get to a certain financial income bracket. So a lot of times, a lot of people that are not making a certain income criteria, specifically under $30 million, $10 million in assets, $10 million in discretionary income, $10 million in annual income, individuals are traditionally not going to be privy to certain pieces of financial information. It's sort of like when I share with individuals on the vault here about private placement accounts. The average individual doesn't understand private placement accounts are international contracts, not just domestic contracts. They're international contracts for people that need loans for their businesses and raising capital, sort of like a VC type thing, but usually it goes to a bank. The average individual doesn't even know how to participate in those. But when you make a certain amount of money, you are privy to certain financial information. So the SEC, which is the Security Exchange Commission, after 1933, said that people that don't make a certain amount of money are not privy to certain financial information to ensure that they don't lose their shirt or their hat or they don't end up on the street. That's why you see at a bank they have FDIC, which is Federal Depository Insurance Company, to protect them from individuals that supposedly don't make over $250,000 or have $250,000 sitting in the bank to protect them from losing, all of their quote unquote wealth. Whereas it's interesting, as soon as you get to making annually $250,000 in income for 3 years in a row, you're considered a sophisticated investor. You're considered a accredited investor. So, what is everyone that's not making that amount of money? Those are individuals that are not privy to certain financial information. So, the reason why don't rich people pay more in taxes is because they don't because they have certain financial information that the average individual doesn't have, and that's a disadvantage for you if you're not making a certain amount of money. So you could go almost generations and never experience certain financial pieces of information. There's financial information that's not even being taught in the public school because it's to protect people from their ignorance. Thanks, Trey Stone, for tuning in live. I just wanted to share that with you all that rich people don't pay more in taxes because they understand how to minimize their tax liability. See, rich people are in what we call certain types of structures. See, I had someone comment on one of our posts. They said, see, the information you're talking about is only for an elite group of people. It's only for a wealthy group of people. What are you working for? Are you working to not be that? Are you working to make your children work harder than you, next generation, than you are this generation? Is it not about your family? See, this is why rich people don't pay more in taxes, because they're focused on generational wealth. They're not focused on this generation. They're focused on passing on their wealth to the next generation. That's why they pay less in taxes. You think about it. If you were able to pass on wealth from one generation to the next, that means you bypassed inheritance tax. That means you bypass probate tax. That means you bypass estate tax. Those are critical taxes when you're trying to pass on wealth from one generation to the next. Not just income tax, but the average individual's not thinking about that. That's why rich people don't pay more in taxes. Because they understand how to put themselves in a position, how to get into the correct entities, how to get into the correct structures. As individuals say, well, the charities that you're talking about, when it comes to a private family foundation, Their books are open for review. No, they're not. They're called private for a reason. There's a difference between a public charity and a private charity. But average individuals wouldn't understand that because you have to have a specific private education. When you understand what private charities are set up for, they're investment vehicles for wealthy individuals. This is had this individual comment on the post and say, well, those charities, those wealthy people got those charities set up after they became wealthy. No, they found out about them after they became wealthy. Because you have to make a certain amount of money to be privy to certain type of entities, certain type of financial information. So once they got to a certain income level, they learn how to, once they got more money, they learn how to mitigate and lower their tax liability even more. But this is coming from people that are having a public education, that don't know what they're talking about. And this is why I do what I do, to disseminate information. Why? Because you shouldn't be privy to certain information just because you make a certain amount of money. Why? Because I can break it down so simply. We're always going to be dealing in contracts, verbally and expressed, written on paper. And just because you make a certain amount of money, you shouldn't be privy to what's considered a private education. A private education means you understand family law and contract law. Family law is private, contract law is private. If we're dealing in contracts, you're never going to learn contract law from a public institution. But this is what public individuals don't understand. This is why I do what I do. Contract law is private law. You learn how to utilize contracts because that's all we're dealing in every single day. On the stock market, it's contracts. Business is contracts. You have to know what contracts put you in a position of tax avoidance because that's all rich people are practicing, tax avoidance. When you get to a certain income bracket, you learn how to practice tax avoidance at a greater level. Why? Because when you are gaining your wealth, if you don't have certain entities in place or structures in place, you'll lose the wealth just as fast as you gained it. You've seen individuals make hundreds of millions of dollars and lose it. So it's not about how much money you make. It's about how much you can keep. And you have to understand how to have a private education to minimize the liabilities, tax liabilities and lawsuit. Even if you didn't get taxed out of it, you can get sued out of it. You have to have the correct tax position. So let's go through the 4 keys of wealth. The 4 keys of wealth are putting your wealth in the correct tax position. Do you know what entity to use or not to use? That's what you learn in private trustee training. The second one is how to protect that wealth. We just talked about taxes. Now we're talking about the liability for you to be sued out of that wealth. Rich people being sued out of their wealth. You have to do it at an arm's length distance dealing. The third one, how to grow that wealth tax-free. How you grow the wealth tax-free? What type of investments are you going to make? Are you going to go into permanent industries or are you going to go into temporary industries, new emerging markets? We're talking about permanent industries. When we talk about permanent industries at the Vault and private trustee training, we're talking about investments that have been around for 500 years. The average individual's not even talking about that. How do you preserve your wealth from one generation to the next? And then how do you pass that wealth on tax-free? You have to understand what entities to utilize to pass the wealth on tax-free. A private family foundation, not a public one. But the average individual couldn't give you that education. That's what we focus on at the Vault. Providing private information. Private education. You have to invest in your private education. It's not free. It's not a government handout. So that's what we provide. Why do rich people don't pay more in taxes? It's because they understand those 4 keys to wealth. It's just that simple. This information that I and our training system has came from private trustees of wealthy people's portfolios. We understand how to control our tax liability. We understand how to minimize our risk. We understand how to pass on wealth from one generation to the next. Tax-free. It's called tax avoidance. I'll give you the case. It's called Gregory versus Hellring. See, rich people wrote the law, so I'm going to share with you the law that they're utilizing. Article 1, Section 10 of the United States Constitution, which is a contract. Article 1, Section 10 of the United States Constitution, in part, says no state will impair the obligation of a contract. Rich people wrote the law, people, not poor people. Poor people can't share with you anything about how to get rich. Rich people wrote the tax law. They're not going to put laws in place that are going to stop them from passing on wealth from one generation to the next, tax-free. But let a poor person tell you, oh, they're passing laws so they can benefit themselves. Guess what? They're in a tax avoidable position. The United States President, Donald Trump, says, I don't have to deal with taxes. Why? Because he's avoiding them. That's why he doesn't have a personal tax return. He's avoiding the taxes. He doesn't have anything to show. If he did, he would have to show it. It's called public tax returns. He doesn't have public tax returns. He has private tax returns, but he doesn't own the tax returns that he's filing. He's filing as a fiduciary. He's filing as a trustee. So he doesn't own any money, income coming directly to him. This is the education that you get in private trustee training. It's just that simple. It's just that simple, ladies and gentlemen. I thank you all for tuning in live or listening to replay. If you have any questions, feel free to type them into the chat. If you want to enroll in private trustee training to further your private education, that is Christian@trustchristian.com. Once again, that's Christian@trustchristian.com. Ladies and gentlemen, the education that we're talking about is a private contractual education. It's learning how to utilize contracts to your benefit. Proprietary information is in the vault. That's why it's called the vault. I will never change the name of this show because it's called the vault. When you have things of valuable possession, they have to be inside of a protected entity. Something that's out of the reach of government. Not because the government's bad, but because there's a clear separation between public and private. No state will impair the obligation of private contracts. Contracts are public or they're private. That's simple, ladies and gentlemen. But if you don't have a certain education, you'll never be privy to that information because you've only been given one education, a public one. Well, are you aware that there's a private one? And I'm not talking about private school where you just pay to go to school. I'm talking about a private contractual education to operate a business entity internationally, to control and pass on your wealth internationally, to go into different jurisdictions internationally, tax-free. Why do you think Google made $90 billion and didn't? In the EU, you all can look this up. It's an antitrust lawsuit. The EU said, can you pay us $2 billion, please? We know you're making $70 billion off of marketing. Can you please pay us? Please. The EU didn't kick Google out. They're just asking them to pay a fine of less than $9 billion when they made $70 billion off of marketing. But they'll tell the public that yes, it's a marketing situation. Their business practices, they're unfair to their competition. Well, why is it called the antitrust lawsuit? It's to create it to where they're not paying taxes. It's just that simple. Someone asked on the chat, do rich people become SPC and put everything in a trust to privatize everything? No. Rich people are focused on growing their wealth using the 4 keys to wealth. I'll repeat them again. Now, is the SPC, when you understand SPC, for most people that are on the line, I'm talking specifically to this individual, so please forgive but listen to our conversation. When you understand SPC, that's called Uniform Commercial Code, which is, I call it Uniform Contract Code, because it's governing contracts in the United States. So, once again, they put their wealth in a correct tax position first, utilizing contracts. So, the second thing is they know how to put themselves at arm's length distance. Does that process do it? Yes. Do they all utilize it? No, because they're utilizing trust contracts. A trust is a separate, distinct legal entity. They're using a specific style of trust too. So if you are not educated on a certain entity, You will never even know about it. If you don't have a certain amount of money, you'll never even know about the trust. There's over 80 different types of trusts. So how do you know which one to go into? You have to have a private education. That's what we provide at the vault. Specifically, the entities to utilize, the contracts to utilize. They have to be written a certain way to even operate internationally. So, when you say protect their wealth, yes, they're utilizing contracts to protect and privatize their wealth, to grow that wealth and pass it on tax free. Because they're avoiding estate tax, inheritance tax, and probate and death tax. Why? Because they don't own it. When you die, if you have money in your name, they will go through a thing called intestate if you don't have the proper entities in place. That's the difference. So, ladies and gentlemen, that's how being rich makes you taxed less. Why don't rich people pay more in taxes? Because they know how to put themselves in a position where they avoid them in the first place. Just like Donald Trump said, he avoids them. And when you listen to him, go back to those interviews and type them in to YouTube and see he says, I know the tax code better than anybody. Why is it that most entrepreneurs don't know the tax code? They say, oh, it's so big, it's so thick. I told you, it is a specific education. He's involved in certain circles that have a specific education. No, he didn't read the entire tax code. There's a public one, and then there's one that says, it's just as simple. Put yourself in a position where you avoid it altogether. That's the difference between a private tax education and a public tax education. There's a difference. Thank you all for tuning in live, listening to replay. Christian at trustchristian.com. Serious inquiries only. We will be conducting a workshop here. I'm still solidifying a date, so thank you all. Look forward to seeing you all there or tuning in on the vault. Feel free to contact us, reach out, listen to all the episodes if you want to listen to them before you actually contact us for a consultation. So thank you all for tuning in live or listening to replay. Peace and blessings.